In 180 AD, the Roman Empire was supposed to be invincible. It had just completed a golden age. 5 emperors in a row, chosen not by blood, but by merit. The best men, the most capable men. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-king, had just spent 19 years holding together 70 million people across 3 continents. He had fought wars on multiple frontiers. He had written meditations on virtue while managing the largest empire the world had ever seen. And when he died, Rome had a system in place. A system that had worked perfectly for 100 years. A system designed to prevent exactly what was about to happen. But Marcus Aurelius made one choice. He chose his son. Not through any testing, not because his son was capable, not because he had earned it, but because he was his blood. And in that single decision, Marcus Aurelius broke the system that had made Rome stable. What happened next was not a slow decline. It was a catastrophic collapse compressed into 13 years. A teenage emperor with no training, no experience, surrounded by people whose entire existence depended on his goodwill. He had never been told no. He had never been challenged. He had no concept of duty. He fought 700 times in the arena in staged battles he could never lose. He commissioned so many statues that Rome ran out of bronze and had to melt down the statues of previous emperors. He renamed the months after himself. He renamed the entire city of Rome after himself. He executed his own sister based on paranoia. He systematically destroyed the Senate. He turned the empire into his personal playground. And the terrifying part is this: there was nothing anyone could do to stop him. The emperor had absolute power. There were no checks on that power, no institutions strong enough to restrain him. The entire system depended on the assumption that he would voluntarily choose to act responsibly. And Commodus showed Rome something it had never confronted before: what happens when that assumption is wrong. What Commodus did in those 13 years set in motion the fragmentation of the greatest empire in history. Not through military defeat, not through economic collapse, but by revealing a fundamental weakness that had always existed. A weakness that would haunt Rome for the next 150 years and eventually tear it apart. This is not the story of a madman who happened to inherit a throne. This is the story of what a system reveals about itself when the wrong person gets power. To understand what had been broken, you need to understand what had worked. For more than a century, Rome had used a succession system unlike anything else in the ancient world. It was based not on family, but on merit. Nerva had adopted Trajan. Trajan had adopted Hadrian. Hadrian had adopted Antoninus Pius. Antoninus Pius had adopted Marcus Aurelius. 5 emperors in a row, each chosen specifically because he was the most capable man available. Each tested, proven, vetted before he received the ultimate power. This system, called the Antonine succession, had produced what Roman historians called the Golden Age. The empire was stable. It was prosperous. There was no civil war. The frontiers were secure. Art, literature, and philosophy reached their height. This was not accident or luck. This was the direct result of a system that valued capability over bloodline, merit over tradition. But all of that depended on one thing: that the person at the top would voluntarily choose to respect the system that had made Rome stable. Marcus Aurelius had decided he could not trust that assumption with a stranger. So, he had broken the chain. And in doing so, he had revealed that the entire system rested on a fundamental weakness. It had no mechanisms to constrain the person at the top if that person decided not to be constrained. One of Commodus's first acts was unprecedented. He immediately ended the Parthian War. The war was ongoing but not lost. Rome held significant strategic advantages. The legions were well positioned. A continuation of the campaign could have resulted in further territorial gains, or at minimum a much stronger negotiating position. But Commodus did not want to continue it. He wanted to leave the frontier. He wanted to return to Rome. He wanted to escape the tedious necessity of actually managing the empire's military apparatus. He negotiated a peace treaty with the Parthians. The terms were acceptable from a diplomatic standpoint, but not favorable to Rome. Historians have generally regarded it as mediocre, a missed opportunity to press Rome's advantage further. But Commodus was not interested in missed opportunities or strategic positions. He was interested in one thing: getting back to Rome, getting back to the capital, getting back to a place where he could consolidate power and enjoy the benefits of his position without the burden of actual governance. Within months of becoming emperor, Commodus began acting in ways that shocked the Roman elite. He became obsessed with athletics. More than that, he became obsessed with gladiatorial combat, and not in a symbolic way, not in a ceremonial way. He actually trained as a gladiator. He actually fought in the arena, repeatedly, in front of crowds in Rome. Ancient sources describe this in painstaking detail. Dio Cassius, writing a century later, claims that Commodus fought in the arena over 700 times during his reign. Herodian, another historian, suggests the number was even higher. They describe him fighting condemned prisoners. They describe him fighting slaves. They describe him fighting wild animals: a rhinoceros, a lion, an elephant. Always, in every account, he won. One particularly telling anecdote comes from the historian Herodian. He describes Commodus entering the arena dressed in the costume of Hercules, carrying the Greek hero's trademark club and lion skin. He would fight 5 or 6 times in a single day. Sometimes he would face multiple opponents at once. Sometimes he would face wild animals. The spectators were required to sit through these performances, watching the emperor engage in combat that was designed for his pleasure, not for sport. The fighters he faced were not equals. They were condemned criminals, people already sentenced to death, given the choice between execution and the arena. The animals were weakened, sometimes deliberately injured before being released. The whole enterprise was carefully choreographed to ensure that Commodus would look impressive, would win, and would hear the roar of approval from the crowd. Now, how do you lose a gladiatorial fight when you are the emperor? You don't. The other fighters knew this. The guards surrounding him knew this. The crowds cheering for him knew this. If Commodus lost, if he was actually defeated in combat, it would be a catastrophic humiliation. It would suggest that the emperor was weak, fallible, capable of being bested. So no one was foolish enough to actually defeat him. The fights were theatrical. They were performances. Commodus was the star of a show in which his victory was mathematically guaranteed. But here is the crucial point. The crowds knew it too. The Roman people understood that these were not real fights. They were theater. They were performances designed to entertain the emperor and to let him feel the thrill of combat, the roar of the crowd, the validation of winning. And the fact that the emperor was spending his time on this, that he was obsessed with this form of entertainment, that he was making this a central part of his public identity, began to send a message to the empire. The message was this: the emperor does not regard his position as a burden. He does not see himself as bound by duty or obligation. He sees the imperial office as a platform for his own gratification. The empire exists to serve him, not the other way around. But Commodus's obsession with gladiatorial combat was just one manifestation of a much deeper problem. Because his behavior began to reveal something about the system of imperial government that had been obscured during the reigns of the 5 good emperors. The system had no real checks on power. There were no institutional constraints. The Senate was advisory only, and Commodus could simply ignore it. The military answered to him. The bureaucracy served at his pleasure. The law applied to everyone except the emperor. Every single power structure in the empire ultimately depended on the emperor's voluntary choice to exercise that power responsibly. And Commodus, who had grown up in a palace surrounded by people whose only goal was to please him, had no concept of responsibility. His spending became legendary. He commissioned statues of himself. Dio Cassius records that Commodus had so many statues made that Rome ran out of available bronze. He had to melt down statues of previous emperors to get the material for his own likenesses. He renamed things after himself. The months of the year were renamed to correspond with his various titles. January became Januarius Commodus. He renamed the city of Rome itself. It was no longer Rome. It was Commodiana. The capital of the empire was now named after the emperor. He gave himself honors that he had not earned. He declared himself a victorious general despite never fighting a battle. He granted himself priesthoods. He awarded himself the title of Hercules. He began to present himself not just as the emperor, but as a god made manifest on earth. One of his favorite titles was Herculaneus, Hercules reborn. He carried a lion's skin like Hercules. He styled himself as the reincarnation of the god. But the deeper problem was not the eccentricity. Eccentricity is survivable in an empire. Rome had had eccentric emperors before. Caligula had been eccentric. Nero had been eccentric. The problem was that Commodus's behavior was beginning to generate a specific dynamic within the imperial court and the military. Because when the emperor begins acting unpredictably, when he begins rewarding flattery and punishing honesty, when he begins to see threats everywhere, the people around him begin to adapt. They begin to tell him what he wants to hear. They begin to avoid any action that might be misinterpreted. They begin to prioritize their own survival over the functioning of the state. Commodus's paranoia became one of the defining characteristics of his reign. He saw conspiracies everywhere. In 182 AD, just 2 years into his reign, he executed his sister Lucilla. She had been peripherally involved in a minor conspiracy, a few senators and military officers discussing the possibility of his removal. But the method of her death revealed something worse than the crime. She was exiled first to an island in the Mediterranean, then summoned back to Rome, then murdered. It was not swift. It was theatrical, and the message was unmistakable. Anyone close to the emperor who might be seen as a potential threat would be systematically eliminated. And this set off a chain reaction. Because if the emperor was willing to execute his own sister, if he was willing to turn on his own family based on suspicion and paranoia, then what protection did anyone else have? the Senate began to experience a wave of purges. Senators who had wealth, land, and influence found themselves suddenly accused of treason. Their property was confiscated. Sometimes they were executed. Sometimes they were simply exiled. Commodus was systematically using the apparatus of state power to consolidate wealth and authority into his own hands. The terror was not entirely random. It was targeted. It was designed to eliminate anyone who might be seen as a potential power base, anyone who might organize against him, anyone who might be capable of mobilizing opposition. But in trying to eliminate potential threats, Commodus was destroying the very structure that held the empire together. The Senate had already lost most of its actual power, yes, but it had maintained a degree of authority and legitimacy. Senators served as governors of provinces, as commanders of legions, as administrators of the empire's bureaucracy. By destroying the Senate's credibility, by filling its ranks with terrified yes-men and sycophants, Commodus was undermining the entire administrative structure of the empire. The historian Herodian describes this period in detail. He records how Commodus would hold Senate meetings where he would sit in judgment, sometimes sober, sometimes intoxicated, and pronounce sentences on men who had done nothing wrong except to be wealthy or to have said something that could be interpreted as critical of the emperor. The Senate, which had once been a body of significant influence in Roman politics, became a collection of terrified men trying to survive another day. One particular incident reveals the absurdity of the situation. Commodus had a favorite chamberlain, a man named Seutyrus. Seutyrus accumulated enormous power within the palace. He began selling positions, appointments, and favors. He became wealthy beyond measure. The people of Rome, watching this corruption, became increasingly angry. Eventually, Commodus had Seutyrus executed, but then he replaced him with another favorite named Cleander. Cleander did the same thing. He sold positions. He accumulated wealth. He became corrupt. The people protested, and Commodus executed him too. Then he elevated another favorite, then another. This was the pattern. This was the pattern of Commodus's reign. Decisions made on whim. Power consolidated into the hands of whoever could best flatter the emperor or entertain him. And the functioning of the state, the actual administration of the empire, began to fall apart. But the true scale of the disaster becomes clear when you look at what was happening in the provinces. The frontier along the Rhine, which Marcus Aurelius had spent years securing, began to deteriorate. Barbarian tribes, sensing weakness, began probing Roman defenses. The provinces were being asked for more and more tax revenue to pay for Commodus's spending, for his statues, for his arena games. But the legions defending those provinces were not being paid adequately. The morale was collapsing. Men who had once been proud to serve Rome were now angry, resentful, questioning why they were suffering frontier duty while the emperor sat in Rome fighting in fake battles in the arena. The provinces themselves began to experience civil unrest. In Egypt, there was a rebellion. In the east, banditry increased. Trade routes became unsafe. The economic stability that had characterized the 2nd century began to deteriorate. Commerce slowed. Cities that had been thriving under Marcus Aurelius began to stagnate. The military was becoming increasingly restless. Commodus had completely abandoned any pretense of being a military commander. He did not lead campaigns. He did not visit the frontiers. He did not inspect the legions. He was not a soldier-emperor in any meaningful sense. He was a man obsessed with entertainment, with spending, with the symbols of power rather than its actual exercise. The frontier legions, which had always looked to the emperor for leadership and direction, were now essentially independent. The governors of the provinces began making decisions without waiting for approval from Rome. The provincial armies began thinking of themselves as independent power bases rather than extensions of imperial authority. Commodus was not interested in managing this. He was interested in remaining in Rome, in the palace, in the arena. The financial situation was becoming catastrophic. Commodus's spending on the arena, on statues, on his palace, on his various whims, was astronomical. The imperial treasury was being depleted. To pay for this, the provinces were being squeezed harder and harder for taxes. But the provinces were already suffering from the breakdown of security, the increase in banditry, the lack of investment in infrastructure. They were being asked to pay more while receiving less. Commodus attempted to solve this problem the way he solved all problems. By confiscating the wealth of people he deemed suspicious. Any senator or provincial governor who appeared to be wealthy, who appeared to have significant land holdings, became a target. Their property was seized. Sometimes they were killed. The proceeds went into Commodus's personal coffers. This had a cascading effect. It discouraged investment in the provinces. Wealthy individuals, worried about confiscation, stopped putting money into improvements, stopped funding public works, stopped supporting the infrastructure that held the empire together. The empire was being systematically stripped of the private capital that had always supplemented public funding, and nothing was being built to replace it. Into this power vacuum stepped a man named Pertinax. Pertinax was the prefect of the city guard in Rome. He was an experienced military officer, respected, competent, the kind of man who would have been chosen as emperor under the old adoption system. Pertinax understood what was happening to the empire. He understood that the system was collapsing. And he began, cautiously, to speak about reform. This was a mistake, because in Commodus's paranoid worldview, any suggestion of change, any hint that someone else might be thinking about the empire's future, was a threat to his power. Commodus began to see Pertinax as a threat. He moved against him. He dismissed Pertinax from his position as prefect of the city guard. This was another mistake, because Pertinax had command of the urban cohorts, the military units stationed in Rome itself. And Pertinax was not alone in his dissatisfaction with the emperor. There were others in the elite, in the military, in the bureaucracy, who understood what was happening, who saw where this was heading. An emperor with unlimited power, no constraints, increasingly paranoid, and no concern for the functioning of the state. In 192 AD, after 13 years of rule, Commodus was assassinated. The method was almost casual in its familiarity. He was strangled in his bath by an athlete named Narcissus. The conspiracy had been organized by Commodus's mistress Marcia, who feared for her own life, and by Pertinax, the same military commander Commodus had tried to remove from power. Commodus's body was dragged through Rome and thrown into the Tiber River. The Senate declared him a public enemy. His name was chiseled from monuments. His statues were melted down. It was as if Rome was trying to erase him from history entirely. But what Commodus's reign had revealed was something that could not be erased. It had revealed that the Roman system of government, for all its apparent stability and strength, depended entirely on the voluntary restraint of the person at the top. Marcus Aurelius had chosen his son over merit. He had broken the system that had worked for a century. And the result was 13 years of increasingly chaotic rule that destabilized the empire and set in motion the events that would eventually lead to the empire's fragmentation. After Commodus's death, the empire did not stabilize. Instead, it fractured. Pertinax became emperor, but was murdered within months by the Praetorian Guard, who felt threatened by his attempts to restore discipline. The throne was then auctioned off. For the next year, the empire experienced a period known as the Year of the Five Emperors, where military factions competed for control. It took the rise of Septimius Severus and decades of military rule to restore order. What Commodus had done was show the empire that the old system, based on adoption and merit, was fragile, and once it was broken, it was very hard to rebuild. Rome would never return to the stable system of the 2nd century. From Commodus onward, the empire would be characterized by military instability, constant succession crises, and the recurring question of who actually had the right to rule. The 3rd century, the century following Commodus's death, would become known as the crisis of the 3rd century. It was a period of such instability, such constant warfare between competing emperors, that the empire nearly collapsed entirely. There were more than 50 claimants to the throne in a 50-year period. The frontiers fell. Barbarian tribes poured into Roman territory. The economy contracted. Cities were abandoned. It took until the rise of Diocletian in 284 AD, more than a century later, to restore any semblance of stability. We tend to look at Commodus as an aberration, a madman who happened to inherit a throne. But the real story is stranger and more revealing than that. Commodus was not an aberration. He was the logical product of a system that had given one man unlimited power, and then assumed he would voluntarily constrain that power out of duty. Think about what the system required. It required an 18-year-old boy raised in the palace with no military training, no administrative experience, surrounded by people who had been grooming him to believe that his position was divinely ordained and unquestionable, to suddenly become the restraining force on his own power. It required him to look at the absolute authority he had inherited and voluntarily decide not to use it for personal benefit. It required a level of self-restraint and understanding of responsibility that very few people in history have possessed, and certainly not a teenager who had never been told no. When he didn't possess that restraint, when he used his power for personal gratification and revenge, he was not breaking the system. He was revealing what the system actually was. Not a meritocracy, not a government in the modern sense. An autocracy that depended entirely on the voluntary goodwill of an autocrat. Once that had been revealed, once it had been shown that an emperor could use the full power of the state for personal ends, could ignore tradition, could remake the empire in his own image, the myth of benevolent imperial rule was broken. What followed was centuries of increasingly naked power struggles, where military force, not tradition or merit, determined who wore the crown. The comfortable fiction that the emperor was bound by duty and obligation died with Commodus. What remained was the brutal reality. The empire was only as stable as the man at the top wanted it to be. And if that man was selfish, paranoid, or unstable, there was no institutional check to restrain him. There was nothing but the hope that someone eventually would kill him. That realization haunted Rome for the next 150 years. It is the realization that would eventually split the empire in two, then three, until finally it fragmented beyond recovery. The seeds of Rome's eventual collapse were not planted by barbarian invasions or economic collapse, though those things mattered. They were planted by a philosopher-king who valued his own son's bloodline over the system that had made Rome stable, and by a son who valued entertainment and power over responsibility and duty. And Commodus had shown that he did not want the empire to be stable at all. He wanted it to serve him. And in pursuing that goal, he inadvertently set in motion the slow fragmentation of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. Not through incompetence, though he was incompetent. Not through cruelty, though he was cruel. But through the simple, terrible revelation that when you give unlimited power to someone raised without responsibility, they will use that power exactly as they please. And the empire and everything it had built will suffer for it, for centuries. The lesson of Commodus is not that one man can destroy an empire. The lesson is that an empire built entirely on the assumption of benevolent autocracy is inherently fragile. It is a system that works only as long as the person at the top chooses to make it work. And the moment that person decides the system should serve him rather than the other way around, the entire structure begins to collapse. Commodus did not create a new problem. He simply revealed the fundamental weakness that had always existed in the Roman system, a weakness that would haunt Rome for the rest of its existence.